Okay, a little bit of intro, and we think that some people might not be here yet because of technical difficulties getting in coming from Meetup, but so we hope that more will arrive as we get going. But we're still reading this book, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event. I don't know if yeah, there it goes. My camera settings want to put my background over the book. And we're reading the beginnings of section 8 down through the sections just before the ontological difference. So in the section on being, as part 8, this is summing up. He's laid out this whole structure in all the previous sections, and this is summing up being with a Y. How is being with a Y different from being with an I? How does this refer to a change in the meaning of the question about being between metaphysics and now? Hello? Okay, so I'm going to go through the usual of giving people a chance to give first reactions and did you reading kind of things, questions you want to raise. We've had a little bit of chit chat beforehand. We're waiting with Jason, but get into that. This is kind of getting to the conclusions of the whole structure he's laid out. So that means that some of the considerations are getting bigger, somewhat more abstract at times, but kind of getting to what he wants to be the point. I have left for next session last time, which will be the last session of the book, the section on being with a Y itself positively considered. It's already being discussed a little bit here. The motivation of the move to it is being discussed here, but the immediate sections are about philosophy, relating this to the history of metaphysics, another capsule history of metaphysics, especially focused on idealism and particular things at stake in it, and then this idea of projection and throne projection as being always behind it, understanding of being, something like that. So we want to get through all of that, but one way to think about all this is as preliminary to the positive statement, what being with a Y is meant to be about and how it's meant to be distinguished from being with an I, or the being of the metaphysics phase of philosophy. The other thing I just want to point out here as a thing to track is Holderlin. He brings up Holderlin very early in the second paragraph, and makes him central to what he's claiming to be doing here, and we have to understand why. What is Holderlin standing in for here? We're probably not going to go off and read a lot of his poetry and appreciate it in German to understand why Heidegger is bringing it up, but we can understand why he's bringing it up from just the role it plays here in the formula here. But I can put that as a question to you guys. I have my own answer to it, but a question to you guys about what you made of that, whether or not it looks like an idiosyncrasy, or if it's clear why he says at one point that the next stage in philosophy consists of preparing the space in which we can hear what Holderlin had to say, something like that, which is an unexpected and extreme claim, let's put it that way, for him. Anyway, so give you guys a chance to give your reactions to this, as well as raising the things that puzzled you or that impressed you, and anything about first impressions that way. Jason, do you want to start us off?
I'm fascinated, and you didn't mention truth, and I really like how he takes being and truth they're almost interchangeable, and you will not hear that anywhere else as far as I can tell. And I think that actually causes a lot of trouble, because people want, they want to direct things, control things, determine things, and truth doesn't allow for that. It means it's coming from someplace else. So I don't know, is there a way to get people to look at it in another way? Because it just seems like, because people don't like having things imposed on them. And the truth, you can't help it. It's going to be something imposed on the Dasein. I've gotten used to that. But most people, no, that's just unacceptable. So I don't know how would you, not in terms of politics. In terms of
I get it. Well, we can definitely talk about that especially in the section where he's talking about metaphysics and what he thinks the history of metaphysics accomplished, as opposed to what he accomplishes in perhaps a negative sense, brings about compared to where he's at. He does talk about being of truth and the truth of being in his own positive things here. We had kind of more of that on the essence of truth stuff a couple sections back. And I hope that some of, before the time space stuff, I hope that some of that did come through and is still fresh enough in people's minds here. But you're right that one of the things that's very much at issue in this whole section is how much something that counts as truthful, clarity about being, something like that, is subject to something like the control of thought or the control of man's ambitions or will or the control of the human, as opposed to how much it is an opening to something other that that comes to Dasein and that appropriates Dasein and commands Dasein in a way. And that contrast is very much kind of what he's getting at here. We can get into that more when we get to the positive claims he's making about what metaphysics is and what it has done. But it's related to what you're noticing about the truth of people wanting it to be something which is, in a way, subject to their control. Just in a nutshell, I'd say that in early modern philosophy and Descartes, you get this doctrine that to be is to be thinkable, because it means to have thinkable attributes, and thinkable attributes are things which are non-subjective enough that they can be shared with others and communicated. So nothing gets to count as actually being a state of being or being in being unless it is thinkable and in some sense, at least in principle, shareable. And this is how you arrive at things like notions of being or truth coming from science or scientism that want to read whole realms of experience as out of existence because they don't meet that criteria or something like that. But it's also a kind of a prior attempt to read out of possible existence anything that could be fundamentally mysterious, right? Or anything that could be fundamentally left open, because it doesn't get to count as being unless it's thinkable, something like that. And you get that in early modern philosophy, and it persists in the different constructions of the Hegels and the Nietzsches at the tail end of metaphysics that he's talking about here. And part of his formula for that is being and thinking as the way that metaphysics thinks about the question of being in its era. But again, we'll get more to that. But you're right that there's a sense of this being something subject to some manner or other of, if not my control, some wider historical human control, something like that. And that's definitely something he's taking issue with here. Does that help?
Yeah, and the other thing is the historicality of being. If you look at that, you would think people would come away from it saying, well, things always change. There is no ground for many of the assertions made through history. But in fact, you get the opposite effect. You get the sense that, well, history is always changing, but we have to find some kind of stable logic or stable reason. Maybe even, they don't say truth, but they want some kind of stability in being. But historically, we are shown that being is not stable, that it is transforming. So it's this idea of truth of being, historicality of being, seem to be working against each other, even though I think for Heidegger, they might provide a new way of thinking.
Yeah, for him, they're definitely very closely linked, but that's because he's, truth is something like this. It has this event-like character. There's an openness in it. He makes the point in the discussion about metaphysics that there's all kinds of, if I put it this way, historiographic details that change in the history of metaphysics, but it also has an essence that remains the same. And he's claiming here that its effect comes mainly from that essence that remains the same and not from the differences, the changes along the way. That doesn't mean, though, that thinking about being doesn't have a history. It does. It just means that in that history of thinking about being, metaphysics has a unity as a one thought about it, or at least one starting point for thought about it. That has limitations in what it can conclude about it. and that is trying to understand being from the standpoint of beings, and especially from the standpoint of thinking. And that, he thinks, is in a way an abstracting from its actuality-like character, its event-like character, and its time-like, the time-like horizon of understanding of it, something like that. But again, this is going to take us more into the substance of the section. Okay, but these are good subject matters to talk about for the substance. Anything further, Jason, you wanted to get to?
No, I think we got quite a bit started here.
Okay, cool. Isabel, first impressions on this section.
Well, I liked it a lot, and I found it very interesting and very different, I think, from what we've been reading before. And I think you explained it now, and I hadn't really digested it, that it's different because he's putting it all together. And that's what I felt, that he was bringing all the strings together. If you go back to the fugue thing, it would be now that you can see the entry of the high pitched piccolos and the basses, and they're all coming in at one time. So he's really doing an enormous work of putting all these concepts together. And I took a lot of notes, but unfortunately, my notes are in pencil and it's hard for me to read them. But in reference to
They're faint,
Holderlin,
sure.
yes, definitely. I saw that he made a distinction between Holderlin, the poet, the one who is influenced by other poets, the one who belongs to his age, and Holderlin, which he now sees as the steward of being, Beyng. So he has this, he sees both, and this is a wonderful thing about Heidegger, I think, that he sees both simultaneously. And I think that's very hard for us to see. But anyway, and I also like the way he takes two concepts like thinking. You would think that thinking is thinking, right? No, there are different uh, going back to understand what it is to think. That in itself is, I find, very extraordinary. And then to find that he differentiates thinking and also differentiation, that too. And as I was reading this along, I was wondering, now I understand this, I think I do, and this I do not. I do not understand. Do I continue or do I try to understand? Or should I try to, or wait till Jason unpacks this? Or should I go to the internet? So some points I seem to understand and some I don't. So I'll be happy to listen for more of this information. I find, as I said, this part extraordinary. I loved it. There are marginal writings in all my book. I just wanted to correct something I did in Italian last time. I did it in the chat business, that l'ultimo Dio is the last God and i venturi are the future ones. By the way, as I was reading this, I loved his use of the word to venture, that these concepts or docile ventures. And there is something of the root of these words also pointing to the future. I'll be listening if I leave, it's because I have to go to the kitchen, do a few things, but I will be around. Thank you, Jason.
Great. One quick question. You mentioned some of the things that giving you trouble, not sure you understood it. Are there any of those you want to flag beforehand as things we should definitely go over, or?
Well, I have to look through my very delicate, because I did put question marks, and if I can find some, but I'm not, I should have prepared that
that's
for
fine.
my
We'll come back.
speech.
We
As
can
I
come
go
back to it.
along. Okay.
Yeah, we can come back. Okay, great. Thank you. So Ella, first, you want to just give first impressions format? I assume you have the format and everything.
Yes. Do you want me to do first impressions or?
Sure. Just did you manage to do the reading, first impressions, prior experience of any of this, and things you want to make sure that we cover in the discussion, anything like that?
Okay. Well, I have been reading a lot of Heidegger, and I'm also involved in reading other philosophers. So, and I have reading commitments. So I went through a lot of your videotapes, which were very helpful. And And I came in only during the last discussion. So this is only my second time here. And so we went through a lot of the videotapes and took a lot of notes. I think I've got most of the basic premises. I've read some other, I'm reading another Heidegger book. I'm also working on a paper right now with involving Heidegger. Actually, that's written by Heidegger. So, but as far as today's reading, I really just got partially through it because I had so much to do to catch up. But so I'm sorry about that, but I may have some questions because I've learned a lot by going through the videotapes and in my other readings. So I'll leave it there if that's okay.
That's fine. A quick question. I mean, if I recall correctly, you have considerable background in Kant. Is that right?
Well, I don't know about considerable. I've read Critique of Pure Reason and all of his major works. I'm doing Critique of Pure Reason for the second time, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert.
I got you. I was just bringing it up because there's several places in our reading where Heidegger kind of uses Kant and his understanding of Kant as kind of a springboard to distinguish his own position. I was just wondering if those were any clearer for you, but it may be that they're embedded in enough around them that's hard to get all at once that it's not that helpful. But I'm thinking especially the stuff on like page 336 and 337. There's a long section 259 where he's going through his kind of capsule history of philosophy again on the particular problematic he's raised in the previous section. But and he spends a fair part of that on the position of Kant within that mini history of especially the German idealism phase of metaphysics. But anyway, if you have thoughts on that or questions about that, be happy to hear them. Okay. Anything further, Ella, or should we just get into topics?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to listen to everyone and to learn more about Heidegger. I think I know. I'm pretty good on the basics and ready to go. But again, I'm not feeling like I got through the reading, and so I might be listening quite a bit instead of participating. So
yeah, that's just fine. That's just fine. Okay. So I want to just outline the main sort of things I want to make sure we cover. The first is I'll put it this way, the Holderlin business. Why is he saying that the essence of philosophy in its next stage, what's going to determine whether or not philosophy is, truly historical or something, is whether or not it can prepare a site for being able to hear the words of Holderlin, right? And yes, he is distinguishing the Holderlin that he sees as having this historical significance from just the historiographically located, romantic poet influenced by Goethe and a few others, in this particular phase in the early 19th century, late 18th, whatever. So yes, he's talking about the parts of Holderlin that Heidegger thinks point to something farther ahead rather than something which is, just situated 150 years ago from his point of view. But why is this Holderlin so important to him? That's sort of the first question I want to raise. And then we get this, a transition from that to this history of metaphysics, especially focusing on German idealism. And I want to pay some attention to how the Holderlin thing leads into the other. And in between, he kind of tells us what he's using metaphysics to mean as this whole previous span of thought that he thinks has a particular approach to the question of being. It's not just that it's asking the question, what are the beings? Aristotle's question, which he previously called the guiding question, as opposed to the grounding question of how does being essentially occur, that he thinks is the characteristic of the new phase that he's pointing to. But it's not just that it asks what are the beings, but he claims that metaphysics is defined by the fact that it seeks the answer to that question by starting from the beings and going back to the beings, starting from the beings, transitioning to being or beingness even, understood as what the beings share, and then back to the beings. So in a sense, there's a claim here that despite all the differences over its history, all the developments in its history, there is a unity of all of metaphysics in the procedure of starting from beings as the authority consulted, the source of truth consulted, the controlling original impression, something like that, for the understanding of being. And he's going to contrast that with the other beginning that tries to begin from being with a Y. He does mention that he thinks that in the first beginning, as he calls it, that the notion of physis, physics, arising, appearing, nature, and the notion of aletheia, unconcealedness, truth, that those notions were getting at being itself. They weren't simply coming from the beings. There was direct intuitions there, if you like, about something like the nature of arising, appearing truth, arising, appearing actuality, something like that, in the original Greek notions of physis and aletheia. But he thinks that relatively early in metaphysics, certainly by the time of Aristotle, those get covered over in favor of a view that views being from the perspective of the beings. Okay, and then he has this giant claim. This is all in the section right after 258, or late in 258, I guess, that there is something accomplished in the history of metaphysics. There's something like the operative outcome of metaphysics, where it ends up, that is a consequence of that approach that it shares, and that is not, put it this way, it's not at stake in all the windings and twistings along the way of the different doctrines in the history. They may change on lots of things, but by keeping that perspective throughout, there is something freighted as a consequence of that perspective initially that comes out at the end of the history, becomes more blatant, established, further, whatever, at the end of that history. Okay, I want to now tie these two things together. Why does Holderlin matter, and why is this related to this thing which is constant in the history of metaphysics? And this is related to the sections we had previous time about this sight of the appearing of the last God and all that sort of thing. Holderlin is the poet of the possible reemergence of the gods. That's the reason that he has this freighted position here. He's the poet who is trying to understand how the Greeks immediately felt the presence of the divine in their experiences of things. He's also influenced by modern pantheism of the Goethe variety and the attempts of German idealism to syncretically put together philosophy and religion, and overcome the opposition between them, as you get in people like Hegel, synthesize them in a way as spiritual history of mankind, something like that. But Holderlin doesn't just go with a Goethe or a Hegel version of those things. He's got this hearkening back to the Greeks and hearkening back to the original experience, poetic experience of the intimations of the joyously divine and the mysterious behind things, to put it that way. That's the kind of atmosphere that you get in Holderlin's poetry, which is, in the general historiography of these things, considered a typical romantic trope, romantic touch. But Heidegger is seeing more in that than just a poetic romanticism. It's not just a way of lyrically enhancing how wonderful the summer light makes you feel, to feel something godlike in it, right? It's more than that. It's trying to intimate, trying to receive and pay attention to intimations of a something behind things that is more than they appear, something like that. So anyway, the point is that Holderlin here is standing in for the poet who talks about the possible reemergence of the gods, or even more, that the gods currently absconded may return, something like that. Okay, So first, just any questions about that placing of Holderlin and why he would care about that before I tied that together with the thing I was just talking about with the metaphysics. Is that clear to people as that's a reason that he would give Holderlin this place of saying that the philosophy is now the place preparing, in the first place, preparation for philosophy by way of a construction, the most proximate foyers in whose spatial structure the worlds of Holderlin can be heard, right? There's something like the decision of the possible experience of gods or the divine, something like that, is announced or put in play as a future possibility by Holderlin. And he's saying that philosophy now has to create the space where such statements can be heard. Is any of that, I can't tell if any of that's resonating with anyone.
Could I get a page number? Where should we be on the page number?
Sure, this is on page 333, section 258. Halfway through the paragraph, accordingly, philosophy is now the first place, the preparation for, right? He's talking about this is what it means for philosophy, the concept of philosophy to be historical. This is the history that it has, the spatial structure where the words of Holderlin can be heard. And then over again on 334, the next page, the first sentence, the next paragraph, the historical destiny of philosophy culminates in knowledge of the necessity to create a hearing for the words of Holderlin. Right. So this is, an extreme claim to make about the next stage of philosophy, something like that. The bottom of the next paragraph, last sentence, we perhaps need to think this history if we are to prepare the space which must preserve in resonance Holderlin's words at their proper time, words that again name the gods and humans, so that this resonance might dispose those basic dispositions which ordain future humans to the stewardship of the indigence of the gods. And that notion of the stewardship of the indigence of the gods we will definitely explore further. But the point of all this is just to situate the reference to Holderlin as central to the next stage of historical philosophy here is related to this fact that his words again name the gods and the humans, or the place for the, at a minimum, experiencing the present absence of the gods, but also the intimation of the possibility of return, something like that. Okay, Ella, question.
Yeah, well, I just have an insight. I don't know how valuable it is, but in reading a lot of perhaps a little bit more traditional philosophy, I'm in different types of groups, not just Kantian groups, but I could see how this would be that he would want to go back and anchor it in, the Socratics and even the pre-Socratics. And he's turning to Holderlin's influence on him and seeing the historical need. Even though Hegel's done this with, he did this in the phenomenology of the spirit, like you said, through the spirit concept. It's almost like he needs to, Heidegger needs to anchor this in historicity somehow in the history.
Yep, he's definitely going to do that, but it's going to wind up being not anchored in Hegel, but anchored in anti-Hegel, as we're about to get to. But Holderlin is not for him in the same place as Hegel. Holderlin is an anti-Hegel for Heidegger here. In a way that we'll get to.
Yeah, this is what I'm seeing as well. I'm not seeing that he is getting on the Hegelian by any means.
Right.
At all. I'm just saying that was, that historical concept of spirit.
You're right. You're right to bring up that historical concept, and we'll get to what the German idealists, especially Hegel, and even the successor to Hegel who read him in a certain way, got out of Hegel on this question. But Feuerbach is what I'm thinking of in particular. the Feuerbach interpretation of what Hegel has established, and for that matter, Nietzsche, both of those together as being what late metaphysics says on this question, and then Heidegger's diagnosis of why they arrive there is what I think is really in play in this section. But both of them are arriving at a place which is the opposite of the Holderlin position. Both of them are going to regard gods as human creations, projections of the human spirit, collective or individual, that is, of an individual great philosophers in Nietzsche, or of collective spirits of whole times and ages in Hegel. But there's something like that where the operative historical truth of notions of the divine is the content of spirit in human history, and in that sense, the divine is a human projection. It is a human creation. It is a, if not quite a shadow cast by the mind, it is an ideal projected by the mind, and its actual content is of human ideals. It comes out of the subjectness of the subject of history, which is a particular human subject in the case of Nietzsche, and as a grand historical, interpersonal, collective consciousness kind of a subject in Hegel. But in neither case is it something transcending humanity or other than humanity. It is an aspect of the mind thinking side of humanity writ large, something like that. In that sense, those philosophies take the absolute, put it inside thinking, and by putting the absolute inside thinking, they effectively present the whole in which human beings reside as being all artificial, all human construction, all the way to the horizon, right? To speak in classical Platonic terms, they take the city and they expand it to the horizon of the whole, right? The subjectively constructed conventional is extended by the sphere of representation, by conquering subjectivity, by assimilating knowledge, which when it encounters something it doesn't understand, incorporates it, and then relates only to an idea that it has made the operational truth of that, something like that. In this way, the thinking subject colonizes and conquers the whole and reduces everything that it actually interacts with to objects of consciousness, which as objects are at bottom constructions of a transcendental subject. In the case of Hegel, constructions of the projected human needs of the particular will of a particular culture or philosopher in the case of Nietzsche, but in both cases, projections from a being. So a being is controlling what the absolute is. A being is controlling what being means. Being itself becomes inessential because all beings are explained from the characteristics of the particular subspecies of being called thinking. And that particular subseries of being called thinking effectively colonizes the whole. I'll pause there to give a sense of if that makes sense to people about what I think he's saying here. So is that interpretation of people like Hegel as interpreted by Feuerbach or Nietzsche, are those alien thoughts to people, or are those things which resonate with your own understanding of German idealism, if you have one? It may be that this German idealism is unfamiliar enough terrain that it's news to you that that's what he's saying here, but his point is that where German idealism and late metaphysics ends up is in something like an explanation of the place or site of the being idea that the medievals put at the top of their ontological hierarchy and call being, or the highest being. In Hegel, that becomes the absolute, but the absolute is the subject at bottom. And in Nietzsche, that's more like a projection of will to power, but so are all the gods. So is the idea of a being behind the appearances itself. One of them still has Hegel still has a place for truth but it's a truth as a reduced to rationality, no longer having anything in itself or mystery remainder. And in the case of Nietzsche, it's a truth that is only the kind of error that human beings need to live. But the point is that the former place or site of being itself and of God or gods has been erased by means of an explanation that proceeds through thinking and subjectivizing philosophy to all of beings. All of beings are explained from the pole of the being that thinks, but that is a being that is controlling what is. Question, Ella?
Yeah, I think, just a comment. I think he's intuiting that philosophy has taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we could name names. We could say Descartes, we can say Kant. You know, here Hegel is being named. So look, he wants to go back to, I think, Heraclitus, Parmenides, maybe even before them. He does channel Plato to a certain extent, and Aristotle at times, but he thinks we need to go back because we got lost. We took the wrong road. We went into the mind and thoughts and sort of sanitized everything, and we got away from being itself.
So that, I mean, it's fair to say that he thinks there's a wrong if it's turn. I don't know that he thinks that the right answer to those things is found all the way back at the origin, although there are intimations that he's paying attention to back at the origin. But he's not like he wants to roll back to Aristotle and things will be fine, sort of thing. He thinks that it is by surveying that whole history that we can arrive at the lesson about the next step that overcomes it. But that next step is new. He's pointing it out as something new, not as something old or previous. It is still in the tradition of philosophy for various reasons, which we'll get to, but he's not claiming that it is a recovery of an insight that Heraclitus had, for example, that went wrong sometime later. It's something that the entire tradition of metaphysics has had as part of its essence. This is on page 334 and 335, where he says, the name metaphysics characterizes unconditionally the entire previous history of philosophy. And the second last part of that paragraph is, the name is supposed to say that the thinking of being takes beings and the sense of the objectively present as the point of departure, and the goal for passing over to being, which becomes at the same time an immediate passing back again to beings. So metaphysics is trying to think being from the beings. That's it's the thing which defines it essentially and is therefore true throughout its entire course. Okay. And he then characterized at the very beginning of the next paragraph that as constant flight from being with a Y. So the claim is that the attempt to understand being as beingness from the beings is a constant flight from being with a Y, where being with a Y names the fact that being has this event-like actuality character. It is a unique event that happens once. It has a history. It is not an essence. It is not an abstraction. It is not a common across many. It is something about and immediately experienced that is that requires a prior openness to receive, something like that. So that's the particular dichotomy he's explaining here is, do you try to understand beings from being with a Y with this event-like character, or being without the Y as beingness, as the factoring abstraction over the experienced beings, where the experienced beings are taken as given without any explanation as to how they arise or appear or occur. And only after they are taken do you try to find what is in common with them in order to arrive at a factored essence of beingness, something like that. So that whole paragraph on 335, he's kind of trying to explain that difference. But the underlying claim here is that the reason that what is accomplished in the history of metaphysics is the destruction of any place for being itself or for anything divine is because that is there in the premise at the beginning. It is not a discovery along the way. It's in the starting point, right? If your standard of what gets to count as having existence is the subordinate beings themselves, you are of course not going to arrive at any way of getting that notion to apply to the being with a Y that is behind the appearance of the beings themselves. You're going to be trying to look for signs of a subordinate particular existence in something which is ontologically prior, so to speak, and it won't have them. So if your standard for whether or not gods exist is, are they like vases and cups and chairs and trees? The answer is going to be no. Of course, you're going to conclude that no gods exist because you're looking for them on the analogy of beings of sense. Okay, and that's not just true of the gods Holderlin is talking about or the intimations of them, but also of this structuring of the event actuality character of the unfolding of truth, something like that. If you start from an abstract class character as the only thing that's to determine what counts as existence, you will never discover that what existence actually has its leading characteristics is that it happens exactly once uniquely, because you started looking for a class character, and class character abstracts from anything that happens once uniquely. You'll never find actuality by looking for a class, is another way of putting this. Okay. So this is a criticism of the history of metaphysics as the place that it was looking, it could not find the things which it later proclaims as its major accomplishment it has succeeded in abolishing. It succeeded in abolishing them only by studiously ignoring the place where they might be found. So metaphysics a la Feuerbach or Nietzsche claims to have depopulated or any world but the apparent world. But the only way that it did that is by starting by assuming the conclusion. There's been one giant begging of the question and looking in the wrong place. Pause to give people a chance to react to that. By the way, welcome, Josh. Sorry if it was hard to get in this time. People reported some difficulties.
Yeah, no,
I
I
didn't
have
change
no
anything,
problem.
but Meetup might have. Okay, great. We're on to talking about raise the subject of the Holderlin business and why does he privilege Holderlin so much? And I was explaining that Holderlin is the poet of the possible return of the gods, or that speaks again of gods and men, as he puts it in this section, and relating all that to what he says is accomplished in the history of metaphysics, where he's thinking especially of Hegel and Nietzsche, or even Hegel as interpreted by Feuerbach and Nietzsche. What is accomplished in the history of metaphysics is you go from a questioning of being a la Aristotle, which is just asking what are the beings, that in the end issues in something like man lives always in a universe of the artifacts of his mental construction, his individually or his collectively, but the beings are at bottom mental human constructs, projections, and the ideal-likes of German idealism that are the realities of the rational is the real of Hegel, that we live in a conventionally constructed world. that's the place sort of where metaphysics comes out for him in these sections. And that, from his point of view, is the disappearing of being as as anything like a beyond and actual that is the site in which anything like human life or activity takes place, and also is the standard for truth or truthfulness, which is not a construction. To say that it's not a construction is not to say that it is not always a projection and a thrown projection. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But he's contrasting anything like an actual listening to being with any attempt to systematically explain the whole content of worlds as constructs of human thought, if I can put it that way, in the way that he sees modern German idealism and its descendants doing. Josh.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this resonates with, I think of Heidegger scholar Lee Braver, who offers what he calls a transgressive realism, which avoids the sort of radical objectivism of sort of speculative realism or object-oriented realists who talk about, this sort of the realness of the objects, which are absolutely unavailable to us, that they're sort of in themselves kind of, on the one hand, avoiding that, but on the other hand, avoiding the Kantian danger of enclosing anything that the world could possibly be already within our scheme. So this transgressive realism recognizes or admits that there is no escaping having that world which is utterly new and fresh and other encounter us in such a way that that we do bring our history to that encounter, but nevertheless it can absolutely shake up and those very conventions or schemes.
I think that's fair. I mean, he is getting at that kind of openness to the new in the event of what actually comes to us from being, something like that, or the decisions we make about or the decisions that being makes with us as to the future unfolding of these things, right? That is definitely there. He is critical of the realism idealism distinction on page 338 in the way that is usually understood. The transgressive realism you're talking about, maybe trying to get out of that dichotomy as he presents it there. But of the two, he thinks of idealism as being the more philosophically aware of itself and what it is claiming of the two positions, but he's contrasting that with a kind of, he calls it naive epistemological realism. He's thinking, I think, of the logical positivists and logical empiricists of his day, who may have a perfectly constructivist theory of science, but don't recognize that that means that they're not as realist as they think they are, because they're simultaneously claiming that the scientific concepts about the thing are all that we know about the thing, and that it's a real thing that's really there. And that just means that they haven't understand Hegel well enough, right? Hegel is not saying that when the rational understanding of the object, Hegel is not saying the rational understanding of the object is not objective. It obviously is. It's of the object, and it has things dictated to it by the object. It has to conform to the truth of the object, etc. There's a correspondence with theory of truth in Hegel. It's not simply fiat constructivist, if I can put it that way. But it still is the case that the assimilated versions of the concept is what the human being encounters and reacts to in Hegel. It sounds like what you're talking about is the term transgressive is trying to get around that and is trying to let that always be something which is disruptible. But saying that our conventions about something can always be disrupted is not quite the same as saying that it is not our conventions about it that are the thing, which I think is what what Heidegger is saying here. It's not even that are the thing. The thing is not the controlling thing, the controlling question rather. The question is, are the deductions about the machinery of construction that we deduce from the way that we handle the objects of sense controlling for how being occurs? And for Heidegger, the answer is no. In the transgressive realism you're talking about, it sounds like they're trying to get more nearly right in a kind of punctuated evolution, kind of, having possible catastrophes of theory sense, re-inject a sense of history into how we understand constructions about the objects of sense, but it's still focusing on notions of being or truth that are related to the schemes we have to have about the objects of sense. And for Heidegger, it's not the objects of sense that are controlling. The first thing to recognize about being is that it happens as experienced in a thrown, individually situated in space and time mind, something like that, and in a historical context, a thrown one, and with all these dispositions attached, and with this once for all time unique aspect too, with this event-like character. And all of those are things which are not simply coming from the being of sense pole as controlling. In a way, Heidegger claims that he has exploded the subject, that he's not making this more subjective because he's talking about this between where the subject and the object meet, something like that. But anything that a Hegelian constructivist wants to put into the subjective pole, he's putting into the experience being itself. And the ongoing event is not so much of discovery and refinement of theories about the object of sense as it is a narrative history with dramatic turns of what is happening to being and the meaning of being and the truth and man's experience of it through that narrative or venture, right? So the accents are very much shifting away from the I want you to help me understand possible objects of sense, and if Kantian schemes are too, or Hegelian schemes are too rigid for it, we'll just introduce a little bit of historicity into them to make them serviceable again for purposes of epistemology. That's still a very scientific concept, oriented technological view of what the philosophy needs to do here. Is that fair?
It certainly is food for thought. Let me read this all together. We can think about, whether
Sure.
what Braver is saying here is maybe does fall into your critique or not. He says, transgressive realism, I believe, gives us a reality that transcends our ways of thinking, but not all access to it, offering a middle path that lets us have our ineffable cake and partially F it too. He's good with humor. These aphoretic experiences enter our awareness, not through the pathways prepared by our minds, but in spite of them, transgressing our anticipated processes. Sometimes these strange ideas transforms our ways of thinking, reshaping our categories around their non-Euclidean shapes, but some permanently escape attempts to classify them. These are the wild thoughts that buck all domestication, escaping stable categories. These are the ideas prized by many continental thinkers as the other to our normal ways of thinking, which helps explain what may look like willful obfuscation and a casual rejection of basic rational principles. Many of these figures do cultivate the irrational in a sense, but for eminently sensible reasons. Okay, yeah. So
I got it.
I don't
know. There's definitely partial overlap there, or partial indebtedness there. Certainly in this openness business, certainly in this allowing the ineffable thought its due, so to speak. But I still see a focus there on the, if I put it this way, the after shake-up reconceptualization understanding. And maybe that's, if I put it in a larger context of more of his work, I wouldn't see it that way. It's just, it's not Heidegger's concern about the matter. Heidegger's concern about the matter is the human being open to and hearing those intimations that are hints that are coming from being itself, something like that. And does he understand himself as living in a once history that is his, as opposed to trying to get his schema of external less than being beings to have enough room in it that everything fits into it. The desire to have a schema for what counts as an object, what counts as a real external thing that is commodious enough that all the things that actually occur manage to fall within it, is still very much a traditional metaphysical concern. It's still trying to ask what are the beings and measure them with a concept that has enough, weird corners so that things fit, if that makes sense. So that's still a very traditional metaphysical concern.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on Braver in which I basically made a similar critique. I said it sounds like it's consistent with this sort of the thinking of worldview, just as Kuhn's notion of paradigms is, right? You have a scheme and you interpret the world via scheme, and then there's a revolutionary transformation, right? So you're still marching from scheme to scheme, from worldview to world.
Yes, and I would put that as, like in what you're describing does remind me of Kuhn, and Kuhn is an example of someone who's trying to use this, if I put it this way, Heideggerian thinking of revolution or rupture in a way that is meant to be tamed to a more traditional philosophy of science, something like that. But I don't think that that's Heidegger's own particular concern, right? Either in the direction of science or especially in the direction of the critique of metaphysics he's actually mostly about. But people who have other concerns are allowed to learn things from this tradition, right? They can revise what they do in their own traditions. It's just we have to recognize that's not the direction Heidegger himself is pointing. It may be informed by what he did point out about the limitations of preview of metaphysics, though. Okay, fine question. I want to get back to this point about, there's something accomplished in the history of metaphysics, and the thing which is accomplished in the history of metaphysics is something like being disappears. People stop worrying about it. It is the last wisp of evaporating hyperreality in Nietzsche, a vanishing concept that is not of any further use. And at the same time that being disappears, God disappears, and the divine disappears. And the point that I'm making is that at that same time, the sphere of the constructions of human reason extend to the horizon. There is only the world, not an earth under it. Mystery is dispensed with. The confines of the city extend to the edges of the whole, etc. Those are all formulas for the same end of metaphysics state of Hegel, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, if I can put it that way. And it is that precisely that Heidegger is reacting against here, and he is invoking the name of Holderlin as the road not taken when that road has gone down, right? It's not simply that there is a grand, metaphysics that has this assumption all the way back at the beginning in Aristotle that is only coming out in fully in Hegel and Nietzsche. There's a degree of that, but he's also saying Holderlin is the sign of a something that is missing here about being itself. So obviously the different positions in this tradition do have their own way that each of them thinks they're dealing with, or they're dealing with this, put it this way, the position of the absolute or the position of being itself. And a lot of the rest of this 259 is him going through those with, Hegel and Kant, etc., and trying to show how they do not break free from his initial claim that metaphysics as such, by understanding being from the standpoint of the beings as such, is always going to effectively beg the question, and it's going to get being to disappear because it can only understand what counts as explanation as something which moves from beings and through beings. And being itself as an essential occurrence, as something like the actuality of the actual or embodied experience of the actuality of the actual, with this event-like character, is never going to be one of those things. So the studious avoidance of that beingness is going to be present in each of the phases. He does have to. The hardest place for him to show that, I think, is in this section on Hegel. He has to show that Hegel. It is possible to read Hegel's absolute subject as trying to save a place for being itself, something like that. But he claims here, I think reasonably, that what's really going on in Hegel is that he's explaining not everything that exists, but the thinkable, and he's already thinking of the thinkable from the starting point of sense experience, and that the thinkable inferred from sense experience is everything that can count as being, is an unstated minor at the beginning of the whole thing that lets the sphere of the constructed come out looking like the absolute. The sphere of the constructed wouldn't come out looking like the absolute unless you had a prior premise that only the thinkable rational attributes of a sensed experience get to count as beings. And Heidegger is claiming that that's there effectively as a premise at the starting point of phenomenology of spirit, specifically. This is all on 337, 338. Did anyone, have issues following that or disagree with the way he handles it? I'm thinking, especially in the beginning of 338, where he says, therefore, absolute idealism, though it seems to dissolve everything into being, actually carries out the complete disempowerment of being in favor of an undisputed and limitless empowerment of beings. The claim there is it seems to dissolve everything into the absolute as absolute spirit, but what it's actually doing is taking one being, it's raising that to absolute spirit, but it's really, what it really means by that is something like collective human consciousness or something like that. And it is empowering that over being. So undisputed and limitless empowerment of beings, I would say, if that's obscure as to whether or not that's where it comes out in Hegel, it's completely clear by the time you're at Feuerbach that that is where it has come out, because the absolute spirit has been revealed to be something like the collective consciousness of mankind, which is definitely the empowerment of beings.
Yeah, I have a
Make sense to
point.
people?
I just wanted to raise a point about what he's saying. He's saying at one point, in different books he says this, he says the abandonment of beings by being. And that's so interesting because, people think, well, I have these beings. This is what being is all about. And that he doesn't really explain why people go in that direction. He understands that they have this metaphysics, but people really prefer the entities, all the objects, rather than this concept of being. And they can't see that there's a problem because they think, well, I got all this being all around me, so there's not a problem with being. But I think that maybe he doesn't express that problem.
So I think you're right that there's a starting with beings which are taken for granted in the sense that they're, put it this way, their ontological or perhaps thinking conveyance is not made a problem. Now, there are traditions in philosophy like Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, and to a lesser degree Hegel, that do try to make that a bit of a problem, right? But they still are going to be starting from something like the givenness of the objects of experience as beings. And they may then, critique, what can and cannot be known directly from them, what can and cannot be trusted as known about them, what is experienced about them might be a projection of the mind as opposed to in themselves, etc. Right? But there's still this givenness of the beings sense. The point that I think Heidegger though is making when he talks about the abandonment of the beings by being is that in the later stages of, he's thinking especially of metaphysics like Nietzsche or technological thinking after Nietzsche, the individual beings themselves lose their being character. They become unstable. They become minor configurations of force in continual flux. They don't have stable essences anymore. They become standing reserve. They become orderable energy. They become raw material. And whatever form they may have is only a passing thing imposed upon them temporarily. So in that sense, even the beings from which the standard, which were set as the standard initially, dissolve under the constructivist thrust of modern metaphysics. The constructive thrust of modern metaphysics is going to end by turning anything you can claim is into only what you can do with it, because that's what gets to count as having an operative category of possible manipulation and power and verifiability and all the other kinds of things that you get in an operational understanding or constructivist understanding of science. And that's also the metaphysics that you get in the metaphysics. That is what you get in Nietzsche. So that the things posited as beings are just temporary configurations for human purposes and partial views. And in that sense, it is in that sense, I claim, that Heidegger is saying that the beings themselves lose being. They stop being beings, they become mere appearances, mere temporary configurations. What actually is the ordering of the orderable for the sake of man's purposes, something like that. That's all that's left. So in there's a place in the question concerning technology where he says, the object itself disappears under the essence of technology into standing reserve, right? Every stable entity that is treated as an object for one purpose or another is dissolved by some other purpose when you want to analyze it for some other for some other end. And there's no one of them that the object actually is, right? So there's no being ascribed to it. There's only procedural power relations that the manipulating technology and the mind directing it can be in with respect to this or that piece of raw material / standing reserve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I always get another sense. I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think there's also the sense that the abandonment of being means that the whole problem of being just gets put aside and people are okay with the presence of beings.
So absolutely right that the abandonment of being or the oblivion of being is just the forgottenness of the question of being, and there being no place for it in the late metaphysical or post-metaphysical technological schemes. But that's not the same as the beings being abandoned by being, right? The beings being abandoned by being is this other aspect of even the particular beings themselves that people tend to naively latch onto lose their beingness. They don't even have the residual beingness of a lowest common denominator of the beings one interacts with, because that lowest common denominator turns out to be very low indeed. It's orderable energy and nothing else.
And what about an altar piece? For Heidegger, there was no problem with a altar where there's lit candles and somebody's praying to it, and there's this kind of presence, or not presence, but being of some supernatural presence maybe. And that doesn't have the kind of being that people are accustomed to. And I always think that, like, the altar pieces, just to get into Heidegger's history, he did get buried like a Catholic and accepted a cardinal to talk at his funeral. He thinks that the abandonment of being means even that kind of access to the funeral procession or the altar piece. These things have been excluded from what is considered being. That's just my understanding.
Sure. This is incorporated in the fact in the description of beings abandoned by being involved in a, if we put it this way, a purely power manipulation constructivist technological view of them. And yes, things like what you mentioned are the reason that he would point to someone like Holderlin as having something like these elements of experience of a sense of the divine, something like that. There's a place in Holderlin, I think, where he says um, things about the divine are conveyed by hints, something like that. There's a intimation, hints, dispositions, as we got in the earlier parts of all this, as clues to what is happening to being. Heidegger, and this is related to the what Josh was talking about the aphoretic or ineffable aspects of experience and letting those intrude. There's definitely all of that going on here. The point, the thrust though of Heidegger's critique in this whole section is he's not just claiming that some of those things have been left out and not given their due. He's claiming to understand why they're not given their due. It's because anything like the experience of being as arising, appearing of truth in the sight of truth as the actual event, one-time occurrence that you're thrown into, that has been erased as possibly counting as existing from the off, from the start, by the premises of the entire tradition of metaphysics, to try to understand anything like how being appears purely by abstracting and leveling and finding common denominators among the beings specifically of sense, right? The beings specifically of sense are controlling for what gets to count as being. And that's not some deduction that was made along the way. It's a premise from which they start. And so, of course, it comes out of the conclusions they arrive at, is the claim. It's a begging of the question.
And it gets difficult to discuss because people are accustomed to the approach that he's criticizing. So it becomes difficult to even get people to even to notice it, that there's this issue about entities as opposed to being. I mean, I don't know how else he could communicate it.
I think that you're right that it's difficult to get people to see it directly in a particular case, because that's kind of where they're most trained in the other way of thinking about it in the particular case. Heidegger doesn't try to get them to see it from, I mean, sometimes he does, like Borges' work of art will analyze particular experience, etc. But normally he tries to do it by showing these larger grand sweeping history things. Everyone can see that living in a world of Feuerbach is not living in the world of Pindar, right? And the difference between them is not simply that we have more science, something like that. It's that Hegel's philosophy is not Pindar's philosophy, and the things which can exist in Pindar's philosophy cannot exist in Hegel's philosophy, and Heidegger is trying to show why. And it's not because Hegel has experienced more things or has experienced them more carefully. It is because he has run from certain possible experiences, right? The overall thrust of this whole section is to try to explain that tradition of metaphysics as one way of questioning being, as what philosophy has done hitherto, so to speak. But then to contrast that with another notion of questioning being, where questioning being becomes more like how being asks questions if you listen to it, if I can put it that way. So he's trying to do this typical Heideggerian role reversal on how you hear the terms question of being. Questioning being, you can question being to the point where being evaporates and disappears and you disenchant the world. That's what is accomplished in the history of metaphysics, according to the thrust of the whole book. And the reason he's holding out Holderlin as the person to think about it the way forward is he's saying that is a process which is the result of a decision that can be revisited, and if we revisit it by actually listening to the experiences that go in the other direction. This takes us back to the resonating or the sense of plight and all that sort of stuff that we had in the earlier sections of the book, and they come up again here. But the underlying point here is that there is an overall project here of something like re-enchanting the world, or if you like, you can view the technological world as a world that is under the enchantment of not hearing intimations and not hearing being, and that spell needs to be broken if you want to reverse where the enchantment is, as he does in one of the earlier chapters. But a world in which those intimations of meaning are listened to carefully and heard is what he is pointing to Holderlin as an example of. But the way he's trying to arrive at that, or the way he's trying to, if I can put it this way, intellectually defend that as a proper topic for future philosophy, is by a critique of the question-begging nature of the answers that the rest of the metaphysical tradition arrived at, right? There is a studious avoidance of a very seminal, clear, cogent, relevant question in how they've considered things, and there's a commonality of starting point that has led to a commonality of conclusion across that whole history from Aristotle to Nietzsche that Heidegger wants to place into question. Okay.
And so the basis of philosophy, he's arguing he doesn't want it to be the human being. So the basis of philosophy is truth?
Dasein, instead of the human being as previously understood as a rational animal. But Dasein is all about this betweenness notion, and we'll get to what he means by that in a second. But Dasein is this term that has that in Being and Time, he was still calling it the human Dasein, and its existence as well as Dasein as we come to understand it as something like consciousness. It's not simply consciousness, because the accent, especially once he puts a hyphen in it, is on it being a form of being. The underlying claim is that existence as Dasein, as their being, as the structured there, something like that, is the actual appropriate place or site for truth happening, for truth appearing, right? But to understand that as a dissolving of what was previously understood as both the subject and the object, because the object was always only an object over against the subject, and the subject was always turning the question of truth into question of predication inside a sphere of representation understood as happening inside of thinking, which means everything that got to count as truth happened inside a sphere of thinking. That was a placement of where truth can happen that happened in Aristotle and hasn't been revisited since. The latest objectivisms just deepen it. That truth happens only inside a consciousness, and that happens as a judgment about a proposition inside a consciousness. That's how or what truth is the thing which he's questioning. That's not how or what truth is. Truth is the original arising appearing to Dasein of appearing being, and words like physis as arising appearing, words like aletheia as uncoveredness or disclosure were original Greek experiences of that level he's trying to get at. But the claim is that is it's in a between. It's not on a subject pole. It's not an object pole. It's in a between of Dasein is the form of being in which being radiates into a located Da, right? Such contents. And this, the event of that transpiring of truth has this event-like character. It is always actual, not abstract. It is situated, not disembodied. It doesn't happen in a realm of propositions that can be ripped out of the person experiencing them and written down in a book and recovered 5 centuries later. And if the latter is going to result in truth again, it has to be because some mind understands them again.
So we do have a problem with translation, because I think he's, in this translation I have, there is a talk about announcing here on the basis of the human being. I'm not sure if Heidegger wrote that.
Sorry, which page?
Page 347 near the bottom.
Yep.
And there's the human being is mentioned, and I think Heidegger was more interested in Dasein, not in trying to define human being.
Yes, but here, okay, so the last paragraph, right?
Right.
Could in itself an essential occurrence radically claim the human being, and if human beings would regain an original otherness, their own own thoroughly used up and splintered essence. And even if regaining this essence had to consist in being claimed by the essential occurrence of being. The point is that from Heidegger's point of view, there was a kind of essence of human being as what counted as the, if I put it this way, narratively speaking, the mission human being was on. The mission human being on was to understand the truths of nature as universal truths, something like that, class-like, universal, timeless. To understand such truths was effectively the mission of revealing of truth that mankind received in the first beginning at the time of the Greeks, received from the Socratics, received from Socrates, right? And that venture issues in modern philosophy and Western science, right? But that is, at the end of that metaphysics, that has degraded to the point where human beings no longer think that they are discovering anything like actual truth or revelation of being in that process, because they come to believe that they are only discovering means of reordering according to their own purposes, relations of power in their economic interactions with a standing reserve, right? In which no revelation of being and nothing like truth is happening. Only power relations are happening and relations of utility are happening, or something like that. So there is a way in which there is a falling off from the original sense of high purpose in that mission of human being that was received from the Greeks in the original phase of philosophy, something like that. And Heidegger is holding out a regrounding of that essence in such an essential mission, but that new essential mission is to be the, as he puts it, the steward of the indigence of the gods, the shepherd of being, which means something like this receptive enactor of the place or site where revelation of being occurs, and in a way that is a replacement of the previous high purpose of dedication to truth that the mission of the first phase held out as a prospect and then withdrew when it dissolved what that truth was into something like mere power expediency, right? So when he's talking about that renewed purpose for human being, he will speak of that as the human being appropriated by being, but technically speaking, in his own terms, human being appropriated by being is Dasein.
Right. So basically saying the human being, when it's historical, doesn't necessarily have the being there.
The other way around. I mean, human being, when truly historical, is as Dasein, and it has history because it is part of the history of the revelation of being, right? The history that matters here is not the history of knitting or technology. It is the history of the revelation of being, and the history of the revelation of being you only take part in if you are acting as the steward or the place or site in which revelations of being occur. So
we can have being without truth, is what he's arguing, right? Yeah.
Being essentially occurs as truth, as unveiling to Dasein when it occurs. And what you can have when that's not happening is oblivion of being rather than simply being.
But you can still have like a being there, but not. But being there with the oblivion of being. I mean, that's probably where people get confused about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's an inauthenticity to it, but that is still it's still a form of being. Even the forms of being that are evasions of being are instances of it. Oblivion of being means not that being doesn't exist in some higher sense, but that it is forgotten. It's oblivion. Oblivion is the lethe of aletheia. That's the same word.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. Because I was trying to understand, because I thought being there somehow accesses some kind of different metaphysics, but it doesn't necessarily have to. You can still have the old metaphysics, even when you're being there, the Dasein.
Well, Heidegger says things like that, in technology, the technological mode of revealing or enframing is a mode of revealing, right? He'll say in this discussion of the allegory of the cave that man is always in some understanding of truth, right? Even if his understanding of truth is a distorted essence, there is always some horizon of what it means to be truth that he is living in. He even makes this point about the ambitions that you find in an Hegelian metaphysics, right? It's getting the mission to try to find something that would count as a stable prior that is the support or site on which anything like Dasein or self could exist. It has that that need from the structure of being itself. There is the Hegelian idea that you're always living inside a what is it at bottom, a giant collective human human construct of human spiritual consciousness, something like that. That only has the satisfying truthy feel to people who are adherents to that philosophy, because it is fulfilling the role of a explanation of the total site in which human beings live and what counts as truth for them, right? It's checking the boxes of a metaphysical structure that has to relate back to these permanent structures of Dasein. And even distorted essences of understanding of being are attempts at orienting human being by understanding the being in which he is placed. You get this especially in the books 3 and 4 of the Nietzsche lectures, where he lays out that structure in a lot of historical cases from the history. But I think that that's also going on here. So the point of this is he claims to be a discoverer of a deeper structure that even the structures of metaphysics that he's here criticizing still live inside, right? There's things about that they're missing. There's things about that they will not turn to and face and question, but they're still living inside of it. His claim is that his picture / structure of the location of the human being is not simply other than the metaphysical scheme, but includes the metaphysical scheme inside of it as one of its essential possibilities, including, you can see the things that it's missing about that structure that it's inside. Ella?
Yeah, I'm trying to converge the subjective. Look at this Heidegger's philosophy with the collective, because, and I like the term collective consciousness or unconsciousness. I know for Carl Jung it's unconscious, collective unconscious, but I mean, if that is the situation, and I'll have to come back in. I'm sorry, my dog.
Sure. So to be clear about a little bit of that, I mean, I should want to complete your thought, but the collective consciousness is definitely the way Hegel and Feuerbach will think about this, and making that an unconscious opposed to a conscious is a move that will happen after, like, Nietzsche gets through with it and claims that the Hegelian picture about the constructiveness of the world that people live in is correct, but it's not a rational construction. It's one that has all kinds of instinctual and unconscious structures and drives within it, whatever. So you get the conscious in Hegel and the unconscious post-Nietzsche, not necessarily from Nietzsche himself, versions of this as the place or site where something like spirit happens. In the case of Nietzsche, you've also relativized that to particular cultures, because by making it non-rational, he's also made it particular to particular eras or cultures as opposed to a human universal. But up to those differences, it's those late metaphysical thinkers that are thinking of the world that man inhabits as being fundamentally this collectively created, structured, artifice from Heidegger's point of view, that is it is a missing of the underlying, if we go this way, the metaphysical support of all that. That is an ungrounded view. It doesn't ask where all of that is situated, because the idea that there's something like a collective human consciousness that has a projected world that it lives in, that's everything, doesn't explain the beginnings of existence. It doesn't explain the beginnings of consciousness itself. And it doesn't really have room for the either the mystery that remains beyond the realm of those constructions, the necessary imperfection of those constructions. And it also just doesn't understand this particular event-like personal actuality character of existence itself. This is the fundamental critique of being in time, right? Ella, sorry, you're back.
Yeah, thank you. That explains the Hegelian aspect of it.
Great.
Now there, to go a step deeper, right? And to get out of the collective, well, I hate to bring Jung into this because it's philosophy, but he goes to the unus mundus, that there's one, which the philosophical equivalent then would be someone like Parmenides. But, you know, there are shades of Heraclitus as well. So
I would say that the closest thing you get to that in Heidegger is not actually one, but he'll talk about abyss, right? Heidegger is not someone who thinks that a basis or underlying that is a deeper environment in which anything like the constructions of consciousness or unconsciousness occur that you get in Jung. Jung thinks of all that on kind of a monist one, Neoplatonic kind of background, and Heidegger doesn't. Heidegger for Heidegger, that's just another piece of a historical tradition, right? The actual underlying is more like he talks about it as abyss. He talks about it as experience of ground. There's where is this on page? What page is this? Trying to find it for you. Oh yes, so on bottom of page 340 and top page 341, right? It talks about the concealment of its seclusion and the unbroached origin, but through the clarity of a heavy darkness pertaining to a depth that knows itself and arises in meditation, right? He's not finding any synergy like, you know, all distinctions erased one as a concept there. Nothing like it. From his point of view, that is a Platonic or Neoplatonic stand-in for a concept that has no determinations in it, which is just like the bare idea of concept or something like that. That's still very metaphysical for him. Instead, he's talking about the clarity of a heavy darkness pertaining to a depth that knows itself and arises in meditation, by which he means something like an original undeterminedness of thought that is waiting for the intimations that may determine it, right? There is a listening for the hints of being, sort of mysticism, if you like, instead, rather than a fixed doctrine of what an original one without distinction must be, right? From Heidegger's point of view, Jung is very much a Neoplatonist on this point, and he's smuggling in a particular doctrine that he's claiming is way more universal than it actually is. Sorry, Josh?
Yeah. Now, of course, I think I'm sure you're aware that Heidegger wasn't alone in submitting the notion of the proposition as a kind of a irreducible unit of knowing or understanding to critique, right? There were,
Yes, absolutely.
from, from a number of sources. But digging even further, thinking of Nietzsche and the system of drives, the direction in which it was taken, in particular by Deleuze, is one in which I think it becomes a rather kind of a challenge to differentiate his position from Heidegger. In fact, it's a passage in which Deleuze is describing Heidegger. He says, in accordance with Heidegger's ontological intuition, difference must be articulation and connection in itself. And it must relate different to different without any mediation whatsoever by the identical, the similar, the analogous, or the opposed. There must be a differentiation of difference in itself, which is like a differentiator, a sich unterscheiden, by virtue of which the different is gathered all at once, rather than represented on condition of a prior resemblance, identity, analogy, or opposition. As for these latter instances, since they cease to be conditions, they become no more than the effects of the primary difference and differentiation.
Too far, right? I mean, I agree with you that for Heidegger, go to this way, logical essentiality doesn't get to count as the determiner of meaning of being, and that for him is an original bit of Platonism that becomes turned into something about propositions and logic by Aristotle and his, Epigenes, right? Something like that. But none of that means that Heidegger doesn't have, the same understanding of, go this way, the traditional logical understanding of identity, difference, the way in which two things which are differentiated have to have something they share in common in order to differ along a certain dimension. All that kind of stuff is just sort of logic that everybody already has. But what Heidegger is saying is that logicality, especially reduced to anything like propositions, is not controlling of what gets to count as being. Understand that view is trying to get it. That view is related to the idea that truth is something that only happens in minds, and that truth is a property of assertions, both those typical Aristotelian views. And Heidegger is definitely disagreeing with both of those. What counts as truthiness is much more like actuality contact, right? Actuality arising appearing in Dasein, in time, right, situated. And truthiness has that, if I can put it this way, empirical character. It is not fundamentally an abstract logical character kind of thing. So that's the point where I can see a relation to some of what Deleuze is trying to get at there. But it's the focus is all on the, if I put it this way, the historical actuality event character of the immediate arising appearing, and not on the how many characteristics are same or different in it, which is still very Aristotelian or Platonic.
Let me.
I want to mention one other thing about the relationships of this to Nietzsche and drives, which is that Heidegger is quite critical of that as anything like an additional move here. He effectively equates it with Hegel and says it has the same misunderstanding of trying to explain anything like being from characteristics of a being, right? It's the attempt to reduce anything like arising of truth to functions of the human organism, anything like that, is going to fall under exactly the same critique he leveled at Hegel. Both of them are seeing, both of them are ignoring grounding and thinking that you can ground the place or site of truth in something which you're trying to understand after the fact from some scientific theory of the human being, something like that. That won't work at all. And honestly, the way in which that won't work at all was already, from Heidegger's point of view, even established by Husserl, let alone by him. But sorry, Josh.
Yeah. The reason I mentioned Deleuze in conjunction with Nietzsche is because it interprets Nietzsche in a particular direction, such that drives must be understood more fundamentally as sense, affect, value. And the critical thing here is in understanding them in that way, you have to understand them as a difference that is always a never before sense of difference. That's the first step, the first point. The second point is that for Deleuze and Nietzsche, a difference is always belongs to a multiplicity of differences that differentiate each other. And in doing so, there is never any ground, any origin to get back to. We're not talking about mechanical differences. We're not talking about bits in a computer network that have assigned values, and those values then interact with other values. There's nothing assigned. There's nothing to get back to. There's no ground that remains what it was in order to allow this machine to sort of do what it does. The world is essentially created anew with every new repetition of a differentiation within the system. So it's a notion of creativity and fecundity that's very radical here. And Deleuze sees that also in what Heidegger is doing. I think that Heidegger could effectively critique Deleuze on the same premises that he critiques Nietzsche. So I'm not trying to argue in favor of Deleuze and Nietzsche over Heidegger, but I'm saying that the point, the level at which the critique of Nietzsche and Deleuze is effective, it requires, it's a tricky thing here because we're not starting with organisms in either case. We're not starting with a biological notion. We're not starting with a material notion in an empirical sense of, atoms or physiological elements or anything like that. We're starting with this notion of differences that make differences and other differences, and everything changes everything else, and so the level of Heidegger's critique, I think, would have to be, it's a. It would have to be a subtle one. Yeah,
I think it's. I mean, for me, it's very straightforward and clear, and it's a sledgehammer on a gnat on this subject. He's not interested in the subtle distinctions if they have in common the thing which exposes them to his criticism, right? This is on 336, where he says, as great as Kant's advance might have been, as immense as might be the difference between the absolute idealism of post-Kantian philosophy and Kant himself, as confusedly as everything then sinks down into the mediocrity and groundlessness of the logical and biological interpretation of the a priori, and in this form reappears in Nietzsche, yet all these differences cannot hide the simple unity of the entire history of this questioning of being. A questioning of beingness in the form of the question, what are beings? And the point is this, that always begins by departing from beings and returning back to them, right? And that means that this questioning of being is overpowered by beings. It is always going to find that beings are in charge at the end of it. There's no way out of that. It's in the premise. So it's a very broad swipe, and it doesn't care about how deep you dive into the logical and biological interpretation of the a priori, and how much you dissolve it down to atoms or subatoms, or how fluid you make it. It's not a claim about how stable or fluid it is, and it's not a claim about what level it is imposed upon. It's simply the fact that you are going to deduce the power of being by conclusions drawn from starting from beings, as though the beings get to decide what counts as existing. And as soon as you decide that beings decide what counts as existing, and you take the extra Nietzschean moves towards understanding things in terms of our relations to them and their power relations to us, that means you're going to dissolve them into what you can do with them, right? And so what you can do with the beings is going to determine what counts as existing about anything about what being is, and the result is being is going to disappear. You cannot manipulate it for your power purposes, so it doesn't exist. Is that clear? I think that's the nature of his critique, and I think it goes through. I don't think it's evadable if you start from that premise. You have to drop the premise if you want to evade that attack. It's a theorem that's broad enough it's going to hit any attempt to derive any of this from this or that particular theory about the logical or biological reinterpretation of the foundation of beings.
Well, it hits its mark. It will only hit its mark where it focuses on how a difference a difference that makes a difference, and within a sort of a system of differences, still presupposes a certain temporary stability of each difference. Which I know that's a vague way of putting it. That Heidegger's notion is even more mobile than that, and that I think is where Heidegger understands better than Deleuze. But it's not about use. That there's nothing. The stability of what becomes of this model of Deleuze or Nietzsche's is not the kind of stability that leads us to a kind of a stable, a set use that we can trace back to some sort of
it doesn't matter. It's still constructed on the principle of manipulable usefulness as what counts as being. From Heidegger's point of view, even that is secondary. That's just part of the critique of technology. The primary thing is that it is not directly tracing to itself to anything like open receptiveness to the event-like character of being as appropriation of Dasein, right? So on the positive side of what he is calling for, as opposed to the negative side, his critique of the technological understandings of the end of metaphysics, right? It's even clearer, right? And you can say, oh, but he needs that to be a stable essence for that to go through. Well, yes, he's entirely willing to claim that his desired reorientation of the purpose of man to be shepherd of being in this open region, whatever. Yes, that is meant to be something which is understandable, interpretable, right? And if someone comes along afterwards and wants to dissolve that for human power purposes, they're just willfully missing the point. They might as well close the book, right? They're just not choosing to listen to him, which everyone is free to do, but it doesn't mean that it's an interpretation of him, right? I'm not saying that's you. I'm saying that I'm imagining a Nietzschean or Deleuzian who wants to dissolve Heidegger's call for, Dasein appropriated by being as the thing that he thinks he is calling for. If someone wants to fluxify that, right, they can easily do so, but all they're going to do is the same as would have been accomplished by simply closing the book. Isabel.
Yes, I've been away. I hope you have not covered this point already. Yes, you said being conceals itself, being, B-E-Y-N-G, and yet being occurs once and only once and uniquely, I understand.
Yes.
So as a Dasein, the only way that being, actually Dasein is needed by being because it is appropriated, but it is actually the only way that we can, if we, I dare to say we are Daseins, that we can grasp being is through that being leaves a trace, history. And therefore, as Holderlin, he identifies Holderlin as someone who has this historical the ability to see being, B-Y-N-G, in its historical character.
So
And
I would just interrupt for just a second, right? So you're right about the first part about being concealing itself, but part of, we get this in lots of places in Nietzsche, in lots of places in the early, not Nietzsche, in Heidegger, in lots of places in the early part of this book, that felt absences are a mode of apprehension, right? You can feel an absence, you can feel a lack, right? The fact that something is concealed is a sense of a there is more behind, hovering around the experience of things, and it's part of a disposition, attunement to it, right? So to say that those things are concealed is accurate, but concealed does not mean no information from that in any way, penetrates any part of our experience. That's not what concealed means, right? Concealed is something which is having the characteristic of not exhaustively completely revealed and determinable in the forefront of the light of the attention, something like that. But existence and consciousness are not like that. They have lots more going on than that. And when he talks about the opening of unconcealment, the opening of the clearing of the concealed, right? The clearing of the concealed is felt as the clearing of the concealed in part because the concealed is felt in it, right? It's still concealed, but it is felt in it. And this relates back to some of the things, this is in a way Heidegger's version of the experience that you get in Plato's allegory of the cave, which we'll come to as an analogy a little bit later. But anyway, I just wanted to, it is not the case that that because being is concealed from us, the only way we have any intimation of it is traces that it leaves in history. We have more direct experience of felt absences, hints, intimations, etc., in it than that. And Holderlin.
Yes, but they are, excuse me, they are experiences. We can only experience being.
Yeah.
We can only experience it. But I was just relating that to the three fates, where you have the fate that makes the thread, the fate that makes the cloth, and the fate that is Atropos, the one that cuts the cloth, to approximate it to Dasein in its mythological adventures. And you asked me about the questions. One of the questions I have is abyss. The abyss brings about freedom. Could you unpack that? Abyss brings freedom. And also, since I'm here, inventive thinking.
Yes, we'll definitely get to
Inventive thinking
Yeah.
versus let's say creative thinking. I understand that creative thinking belongs to the first beginning, and inventive thinking is of the other beginning. And inventive thinking, for my brain to understand it, this is the way I understand it. In the event, if thinking, inventive thinking, in the event, because that's the only way that we have this type of thinking. Okay, thanks.
So let's talk about abyss and freedom first. There is a sense of there's a sense in the historical of a future undetermined where decisions are made, something like that. There is and that's there is an out of abyss of that. There is a previously undetermined of that. There is a in no way constrained by a prior system to have to be this or that way of that. In his one of his essays on the essence of truth, the one that's in Basic Writings, I believe, he mentions at one point that he says the essence of truth is freedom, and he says resistance to this proposition is based upon misconceptions, the most obstinate of which is that freedom is a property of man. And the point there is that there's something about being which is free, right? There's something about truth which is free, in the sense that it has this subject to the future determinations of essential decisions, right? And there is a abyss means not grounded, means ungrounded. It's the unground, and a grounding in the unground is the same as saying that there is a yes, a situation of an ontological site or structure in which something exists, in that sense a ground, but also an undeterminateness, an unconstrainedness, a open and mysteriousness of the relation of Dasein to being, right? So if Dasein is holding itself open to being as much as it can, it means that some of what happens as it is appropriated by being is going to be up to being, and in that sense undetermined, both by Dasein and by previous history, and in that sense free. So that's the aspect that, if I can put it that way, that links the abyss with the freedom of the particular kind he's talking about. I hope that helps. There's lots of people with questions. Ella?
Yes. So I'm trying to bridge the individual Heidegger with the collective. And I've gained a lot of insight so far. So I have a question toward that end. I mean, other people, other philosophers have tried it, obviously, you know, in the last couple thousand years, and he's pretty much saying, no, you know, we got to shed that skin, as it were, and think and feel differently. So there's sort of a conflict there, because he is building another system and he is dismantling other systems. But that's fine. That's what you do in philosophy.
I mean, in his claim, he is building another structure, but he would deny that it is a system, and he's trying to leave it open, and he knows some of is provisional and will be superseded.
Yeah,
But
he's not calling it a system.
but I don't disagree with you in principle, but he would avoid the word system for the thing that he is building. That's all.
Yeah. So what is he calls it a structure? Correct.
People after him mostly called it a structure. He calls it a venture. He calls it a new beginning. He calls it a preparation, contributions to a preparation.
Okay.
He uses these deliberately provisional and deliberately less ambitious words for it than system.
Okay, so with the collective then, you know, previous philosophers have, take Hegel, for instance, there are others. They have some type of aim, as it were. What is his aim for the collective? Does he articulate this at all? And in the collective, is there an idea about the family, society, country, nation, whatever, being the greater goal and not the individual? Or is that incorrect?
So first of all, to understand, there are various ways in which he's down on collective as anything like a standard compared to what you would get in something like Hegel. We already saw this a bit in Being in Time, with the focus on authenticity as ownness, with the claim that the self is always its own. There's a claim going throughout here that these intimations of being are rare and for the rare. There is a critique of of a lot of the early modern metaphysics in particular, that things which were less readily communicable and reachable by all were dismissed as not being possible contents of truth, to the point of like dismissing all the qualia, dismissing all of mood, etc., that he regards as one of the modes of revelation, of revealing. What am I getting at? I'm getting at the fact that he is deliberately individualist about what he thinks of as the way in which truth appears. He will have a whole separate doctrine, which we'll get to towards the end, about language as the house of being, about how these things are communicated and passed from thinker and sayer to others. But understand, where he comes into it with a critique of the attempt to make universal communicability a standard, as it will destroy all the things delicate enough to matter here. Okay, so in that sense, there's an extremely individualistic, individual intellectual intuition standard here, like that you would find in any medieval mystic, right? Or in any number of Platonists for that matter. So it's not unless it can be verified by all scholars, it doesn't get to count as truth. It's very, very far from that. And simultaneously, there's a critique of the tendency of Dasein to be dependent upon the structures that it is inherited from others in a way that lead it to forget itself and level down to common thinking, the structure of the they in Being in Time I'm thinking of, and a sense of that alienation related to all of that is very much part of the whole analysis of Dasein that we got in early Heidegger, specifically before all of this focus on essence of truth stuff. Okay, so already we're in a very individualistic place, right? Does he still have a doctrine of how all this can ascend to the collective? Yes, and we got a bunch of it last time where he was talking about the future ones and the way in which a set of people who adopt the mode of thinking of the new thinking, the mode of thinking of Dasein, will originally be scattered and rare and communicate with each other fitfully. It leaves open the ways in which they will disagree. They will experience these things in different spheres of their life, etc. He lays open the possibility of all that being appreciated by put it this way, a receptor class, and all of that eventually potentially informing the art and style of a nation on the model of the way it did for the Greeks with the with their experiences and their poetry, etc. Okay, so there's a kind of archetype or model there that is more like that you find in the structure of Gnostic sects than like the necessary unfolding of the philosophy of history that you get in a Hegel, right? It starts with peak private insight. It is communicated to others in the know. It is expected to inform them, but the way in which their action will matter in the world is because of felt wants that shake I think it's the line in Questions Concerning Technology, who says, a felt absence that shakes everything true and real. What do you mean by that? There is a kind of sovereign not going along with what doesn't go in this direction. That is a point of independence from the surrounding society and the surrounding history. And he expects that is the thing that is the way in which real historical departures that are really original occur, and he shares with others in his tradition, like Nietzsche or Heinrich Heine, the conviction that those are the elements that actually move history, right? The line in Nietzsche is that thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world, right? That's a proposition that Heidegger would heartily subscribe to. So does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent question, by the way. Josh?
Yeah, was I understanding you in the past? I thought that you were arguing that Heidegger could be considered or belong to the realist tradition when it comes to the understanding of sort of the goals of science. And if that's the case, I'm wondering how you reconcile that understanding of Heidegger as a realist, in which case there would be we could ground our questions or our investigations, our empirical investigations, on the basis of of what nature offers. In other words, that in a way that can go outside of normative or discursive considerations. That's where the normative and the discursive can stop. It stops where it arrives at something independent in the real. But if I don't know if I'm misreading you, but I'm just wondering, because it seems to me that it's hard for me to reconcile Heidegger in those terms.
So I don't think that he is primarily staking out a position in that realism or realism construction or realism idealism debate. I think that he is a strong critic of the German idealistic tradition. He is a strong critic of what I would say would count as constructivism or nominalist constructivism in science and understandings of science of the kind that was championed by Nietzsche. There's no question to me that he is a critic of that. But it's not because he is claiming to equip scientists with a realist epistemology that will enable them to get beyond constructivist barriers. He is not a constructor of epistemologies for scientists at all, right? His this philosopher's reorientation is different from that. I think especially in the later Heidegger, if you think in particular of the what is called thinking book, there are things there where he gives extremely direct critiques of what you could call scientific reductionism, that tries to dissolve the objects of sense into the scientific theories about them, in a way that I think is, is unmistakable. There's no way to turn him into someone who is a partisan of those views after you read his analysis of the tree in bloom and the scientist who wants to dissolve the tree in bloom, as opposed to what Heidegger knows that he knows about it. But the claim in that is something like that what other traditions would call the experiential life world is real. That's not a realism claim about philosophy of science. It is a claim about the truth status of the realm of philosophy against a scientific critique that wants to dissolve that entire realm, if that makes sense. It is a staking out of a realm, a sovereign realm of direct experience of reality by intellectual intuition, that rejects any of the nominalist or technologicalist or Nietzschean dissolving critiques that try to get all of those things to turn into merely a house of mirrors set of appearances that are historically contingent and infinitely movable and replaceable. There's none of that in Heidegger, right? And if you want the proof that that's not where he not his motivation in any of this, just go to the section on the in the question in the what is called thinking book on the tree in bloom and the critique of it from the positivists that he that he gives there, and all of this in the context of he's quoting some lines from Nietzsche ahead of time, so it's clear that this critique is meant to hit Nietzsche as well as the scientist. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Great. Okay, and it's fair to ask whether or not that perspective that he has by the time of the what is called thinking book is already there in the 20s or 30s. It's an open question about whether or not he moved on that, but I think by the time of the what is called thinking book, it's clear where he's on the subject. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about some of the commonalities I see when he gets to some of the views of being and projection stuff, and this casting loose business in every projection of the throne projection, starting on 356. And I want to relate some of that to, I take a whole bunch of this passage as making allusions to the doctrine of the allegory of the cave. And I want to see if other people see this here. This is the section beginning on 356 about the throne projection as a casting away, casting loose, not casting away, casting loose. Okay. In casting, this is on 356, in casting loose from beings, the human being first becomes the human being. For only in that way does he turn his back to beings and thus come to be as the one who has turned back. Yet the question remains, how does this casting loose happen inceptually, and how does this inception ground history? The human being hitherto, the one who in casting loose has immediately turned back, the one who in that way for the first time has traversed the differentiation between beings and beings, who lacking the capacity to experience this differentiation itself, let alone to ground it. But the turning back, the task is to know in the first place the way of tearing in the kind of dowry as well as the way in the turning back. What was already there is now encountered as what ties down what it is that beings are now found to be, and what is now found to be a being, and which view of being is retained by the human being and turning backs to being. And the casting loose and turning back are forgotten being the next step. Okay. I admit that it is possible to read all of this as talking only about a necessity of a next step which goes beyond any of philosophy hitherto. But especially the talking about the casting away and the turning back reminds me of things in the Allegory of the Cave, and even in his analysis, the Allegory of the Quick Cave and the Essence of Truth book. The actual mentions he makes of Plato here are only negative ones about that it's not recollection, as has been said since Plato. He does say it's based on a forgetting of the turning back. What's the point here? I want to start with going back to the Hegel, Feuerbach, Nietzsche position of mankind is living at the end of metaphysics, is living in a world of his constructions fundamentally, and those constructions extend to the horizon; they swallow the whole. Right? There is a definite parallel between that situation and the Allegory of the Cave. In both cases, it is human beings live in reaction to shadows cast by artifacts. The artifacts are images cast by the human mind, if you like. So in that sense, the structure of the Allegory of the Cave recreates some of what that structure is that Heidegger critiques in the earlier parts of the essay and sees a need to move beyond. Okay, that's the first point. Then the casting loose is a turning away from beings. The beings understood as potentially understood as potentially having that character, and there's a turning towards a possibility of experiencing the event of being itself. I do not think that Heidegger is equating that directly with anything that Plato experienced or is talking about in the Allegory of the Cave, but in his own analysis and Essence of Truth, Heidegger does relate that part of the allegory, the first turning away from the cave simulacrum, if you get me, to the always already being in the truth of Dasein, something like that. What's the point of all this? I see there being parallels here to moves that Plato had already had intimations about. And we can ask the question of how much Heidegger is recapitulating that move on a what he thinks is a different plane, what he thinks is on a deeper level, perhaps. But from the standpoint of the Platonic corpus, right, the notion that the world consists of shadows cast by artifacts created by the constructions of past human collective understanding, that's not a new thought we only arrived at Hegel. That thought was already there in Plato. Not only that, the puppeteers of artifacts were understood to be the sophists, and the greatest sophist was thought to be the political multitude. So the city and the illusions of the city and the conventions of the city were thought of as the actual caster of the cave images, right? And from that point of view, the idea of philosophy as the liberation, as the attempted liberation from the captivity of those cave images is related, I can easily rate it at least, to this desire to move away from anything like the disappeared being inaccessible that Heidegger sees at the end of metaphysics, to something like a more original or direct understanding of being. Now, after that point, I think they diverge. Because after that point, there's no question that Heidegger is pointing towards this event-like revelation, almost personal character of Dasein as receptive of the arising appearing of truth, something like that, as opposed to anything like an ascent to true being by the method of finding commonalities in the beings, which from Heidegger's point of view is still just being ruled by the beings. So I'm not saying that Heidegger would subscribe to any of the Platonism after that point, but I do see a commonality in the Platonic reaction, the Platonic understanding of the sophists and Heidegger's understanding of where mankind is at the end of metaphysics if he accepts and believes in the Hegelian or Nietzschean understandings of truth. Comments or reactions to that? Josh first. if your hand isn't up from before. Maybe your hand was up from before. Ella, you want to go next?
Yeah,
Jump
I
in.
have a comment on that.
Sure.
So in the cave, in Plato's cave, they are, living in a world of, they're delusioned, right, by the shadows and tethered to their seats and their heads.
Mhm.
So you break free and then you manage to get out of the cave. You're in the blinding light. It's difficult to see at all. But the idea, the greater idea, is to head toward reason, rationality, and the forms. The form of the good, particularly, but all of the forms of justice, beauty, etc. Now, when you get out of Heidegger's cave, so to speak, metaphorically, and you're shaking off philosophical history, and you are in the opening, you are opening up in Dasein to, I don't know, something, to being, capital B, then what is going to come in from the environment, or how will you see the world differently? Plato's got some answers. Maybe they're not correct. I would say Heidegger says that's not the road to go down. But what are his answers? You've made it out. What now? You're in being. How do you see the world differently? How do you act differently? How does the world seem different to you with this new consciousness?
All excellent questions. And I mean, there's a fair portion of that which is sketched in the in Being in Time, and there's other portions that have only been sketched here in the sections on the that we read a few times ago, maybe before you got here, on the essence of truth and on Dasein. But the first thing is a different sense of your identity as their being, and that includes with it a sense of being appropriated by being and assigned a mission by being to be the place or site in which the truth of being can be unveiled. So there is a called to truth aspect in both of these narratives. That called to truth aspect is central to Dasein's answer to your question. Then the extra thing, well, not extra thing, one extra thing is that call to truth is determinately historical in Heidegger. It's situated in the history of the unveiling of being and thought about being in the history of philosophy and in what is needed next in the history of philosophy. So there is, in that sense, a part of a progressive endeavor, which is not simply a human endeavor, but which is a progressive revelation of being, if you like. So it's called into that history as mission, if that makes sense. And that mission includes a lot of focus on past thought, on the history of philosophy, on the original beginning, but also on, what is happening, what is eventuating the main event going on now, and your intimations, including your not fully articulated or fully rational, sensitive, disposition-based intimations as to what is happening now. From Heidegger's point of view, the essential thing that is happening now is that nothing is happening to being. He's on a rescue mission. Being needs to be rescued from oblivion and forgottenness. Does that make sense?
Yes. And who would be the rescuers?
any Dasein thinkers and sayers who feel that call, right? It is a purely voluntary, those who are called no kind of mission. Does that make sense?
Yes. And well, one last follow-up question, if I may.
Yep.
So sorry for sounding Kantian here. So
No problem. I sound Platonist at times, so we're allowed.
is there any type of duty to be, if you are a Dasein thinker, to rescue other people?
Fair question. I mean, in the allegory of the cave, the philosopher has to be compelled to return to help the fellow prisoners, but some of this he gets at when he talks about language. At bottom, the reason is less the rescue and more the continuation of the mission through the finiteness of human life. In other words, the accent is not on those who don't know this have to be saved from the captive fate that they are in for the sake of the greater human flourishing and fulfillment they can have when liberated. There's a little bit of that, but there's a sharper notice on for this mission to continue and succeed, seconds and followers are required. Nobody can do this themselves in their own lifetime. Heidegger has a strong sense of the limitation of individual minds and of mortality. This is not going to be over quickly. It needs many hands and generations of hands. So the task itself is the main, well, not main, but it's a principal driver of the need to communicate this need from the task itself rather than from the benefit that it brings to the others called to it. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Very good questions, I must say. Okay, Josh, I assume your hand is still up from a previous time. So unless you jump in, I'm gonna put it down. Okay, so I wanted to get at those issues of the cutting loose in relation to the allegory of the cave. I want to set up a little bit next time. A lot of this stuff that we covered this time is a intro to what he's going to mean by being with a Y itself. When I say itself, what I mean is that the stuff about Holderlin, the stuff about the history of metaphysics and its distortions are motivations for the move to the new view that he is laying out. Even the sections about the ontological difference are really just an attempt to explain how he thought of this same ground he's going over here at the stage of being in time, where he talks about it in those terms. He's not recanting what he said there, but he thinks that what he said there when he phrased all this in terms of the ontological difference is not the proper way of understanding it. It was a preliminary version of noticing the issue, especially from the standpoint of previous ontology and a gap in previous ontology. But after the single chapter on the 266 on the ontological difference, we're going to get to being with a Y, with a subtitle of event, and the very first sentence of which is going to be being is the appropriating event. So we're getting to the positive doctrine of what he's talking about as being, and then he'll take that through Dasein and human beings and a few other, and language. So the point is that what we want to make sure that we try to gain some clarity on next time is what he means by being with a Y, how he's distinguishing it from the being hitherto investigated by the history of metaphysics, and that as kind of the wrapping up concept for the structure of this whole book. If you go back if we go back a little bit to the beginning, when we started off, I mentioned, and we were interpreting chapter 2 actually, that there's an element here of a attempted re-enchantment of the world, or an undoing of a disenchantment of the world, something like that. And we got some of that same direction, apparent motivation in the references to Holderlin here, and in the contrast with the being dissolving versions of late metaphysics from Hegel and Nietzsche that were the main things being critiqued in the section we just finished. But now he wants to positively lay out what it means to understand being as he understands it, being with a Y, which is supposed to be the subject matter of the new beginning in philosophy and what it should investigate. And it's not enough to just have this concept where this concept is being laid out, effectively as a research program of this is what new philosophy should be focused on, trying to explore, trying to understand, makes its new problematic, something like that. And that winds up being related also to Dasein and the human being, and to language in ways that we want to pay attention to in the final sections. But the idea is to cover all of that stuff in our next session on the 24th of November. That's still before Thanksgiving. It's week before Thanksgiving on the Sunday. That's 4 weeks from now. And the amount to cover is just the balance of the book. Because it's the end of the book, that's only about 34 pages. Because it's the end of the book, any questions about the reception, meaning of the book as a whole, what you got or didn't get out of it, is also welcome next time. And we also can spend a little bit of time next time talking about things we might do next. I have some suggestions there. There are a couple of essays from the translation collection of essays, Basic Writings, one on the essence of truth and the other on the origin of the work of art, that I think might be reasonable follow-ups to this, but I'm open to other people's input as to the things that they think they might want to do next. And also about whether or not we want to take a break over the holidays and so, that sort of thing. So anyway, those would be welcome consideration next time, but for next time, we're just gonna finish the book, try to understand this being with a Y and how central it is to the future program he's pointing towards, understand it not just as a single concept, but as a set of future tasks. And then any thoughts on or questions on the whole of the book. Okay, that's all I wanted to get through. I'm going to give people a chance to ask their own questions or anything that you think we glossed over too fast. If not, we might, oh, Isabel, go. Isabel?
Yes. What about my question about inventive thinking?
Oh, yes, yes.
Versus creative thinking, and
Yes.
I understand inventive thinking to be of the other beginning, and creative thinking to be of the first beginning. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Fair question. So this gets into thinking and the way in which the meaning of thinking changes from the older version of philosophy to the modern version of philosophy, if I can put it this way, or at least he wants it to. So thinking in the first period, thinking in the history of metaphysics, is used as the other on which being is projected and understood, is the claim. In other words, we understand being in contrast to thinking, or being is that which thinking thinks about, or being becomes the object pole of the subject-object distinction, or we eventually in later metaphysics subjectivize what being is as what it means for thinking. We also wind up legislating that what can count as being is that it be thinkable, right? There's a whole cluster of things around thinking in that traditional sense, where being both first sets a standard, thinking both first sets the standard for being, and then, if I can put it this way, censors or determines what gets to count as being a being, something like that. In that, there can still be creative thinking, and creative thinking points to creation, which thinks that it's thinking which makes the things, which is characteristic of idealism, which thinks of the things as thoughts in the mind that creates them, whether that's the universal human subject, or thoughts in the mind of God for the theists. But there is a relation of thinkings to beings, which is something like that the thoughts could be the beings themselves, they could be blueprints for their making, but thoughts are related to beings as the constructors of them, right? So the thought likeness in beings themselves, their information content, if you like, is coming from a prior thought character. And Heidegger sees in the medieval period in the middle of this whole history, before you get the Hegelian notions of these things being created as projections of the human mind, you get the idea of these things being created as constructs of the thinking or mind of God, right? And then the Hegelians put in collective human consciousness in that place. But all of that would be what creative thinking is. It's imagining that thinking is capable of drawing up the blueprints for what shall exist, and then the one means or another of instantiating those that makes the things that are. And creativity in that sense is definitely what you get in Nietzsche as his kind of lodestar. That's right, the right word. He wants creative thinking. He wants creative philosophy. He wants philosophy to create and found and shape and reshape. And that winds up reducing the things about which the poetic thinker, poetic means making, thinker is thinking, becomes raw material. So this is not the notion of thinking that Heidegger himself is going to be enamored of, right? What does inventive thinking mean in contrast to this? Inventive thinking is talking about the fact that there is an indeterminacy of what is in the future that is coming out of something like the intimations from being itself. There is a notion of participating in the ongoing process of a changing historical revelation of being itself. And inventive is his term for those aspects of it, that it's not constrained by a system, it's not constrained by a past. It has this future, once undetermined, future narrative history like character. It has a coming out of the freedom of the abyss that we talked about before, and this responding to the call of being itself character, and all of that he's calling inventive. Is that distinction first clear?
Yes, it is. How do you like my in the event thinking? In just to understand it in my brain. In the event thinking.
I mean, he does think that inventive is also about the event, but I don't think event is there in the German for inventive. Venture might be in both. It's more of inventive. Inventive is for the adventure of the unfolding in time, is the way I would think about it. Yeah, but the other thing that's going on here is that it's inventive because there's a uniqueness of there's uniqueness of character of it, which is differentiated from the commonness. There's a focus on the common in the older notion of thinking, which is why it arrives in class-like characters and why it arrives at things like blueprints, right? Blueprints and class-like character are all about things which are copyable, right? And creativity is all about making new instances of the thing of which you already have a diagram or mental copy, right? And inventive is of something new, where the focus is not on the reproduction of something from a pattern, but the focus is on it not being what was there before, or it being unconstrained, not somewhat unconstrained or somewhat free of, not determined by what was there before. So creative and copying line up with one another, and they line up with focus on the koinon, on the common, and on the idea, and on the pattern, and on the essence, and on the universal. And instead, inventive is focused on this happening once in history, thrown, embodied, in a place at a time character of actuality. Okay, thanks for bringing that out. We should have definitely covered that. So glad you brought our attention to it. Okay, so for next time from 266, that is page 366, section 266 to the end. And does anyone have any problem with the 24th of November? All right, if not, I will stop recording and put up a video about this sometime later tonight on YouTube for those who want those things. Thanks everyone for attending.
You.
And see you next time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.